Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Stein. Good to see everyone here, and welcome to those watching at home. I'm the Sady and Ludwig Kahn director of the L&D Leve Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm so pleased to invite you to today's double book talk. It's the second double book talk we have experimented with, and the last one with books by David Myers and Nomi Stolzenberg and Michael Kasper and Nathaniel Deutsch was wonderful. So we are excited to start to continue with this genre. This book event is part of the Kahn Book Talk in German Jewish Studies, and I want to extend my thanks to the staff of the Leve Center for organizing an elegant event as always. We have books should be available for sale and for signing after the talk, so I hope you can stay and acquire your copies, but if you can't, you should be able to get them from your local independent bookstore, as well as from the Jeff Bezos machine. Thanks so much to the University of California Irvine Center for Jewish Studies and University of Southern California School of Religion for co-sponsoring us. I'm seeing new faces in the audience, and there are brochures about upcoming events in the back, and we hope you can join us at those, and if your email isn't already on our weekly email list, to add it. And I'll ask you just quickly to silence anything that makes noise that you have on your person, besides yourself. So we gather today for an event entitled Where Do Jews Belong? Two Perspectives from the Jewish 19th Century. And I'm really pleased to welcome two dear friends and colleagues to be in conversation with me and with one another, Jessica Marglin and Matthias Lehmann, who have been my colleagues and stalwarts throughout my career. So it's really wonderful to gather together. And they've also been collaborators, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Jessica Marglin is a professor at USC. She works on the history of Jews of the Mediterranean and North Africa with a special focus on law. We are celebrating today her second book. Her first was called Across Legal Lines, Jews and Muslims in Modern Morocco, and explored the Moroccan legal system in the 19th and 20th century and its use by Jews and Muslims. And the book that we are here to celebrate today is entitled The Shamama Case, Contesting Citizenship Across the Modern Mediterranean, published just hot off the press from Princeton University Press. And as we will explore in conversation, it tells the story of a complicated lawsuit that ensued after the death of a wealthy Tunisian-born merchant by the name of Nissim Shamama. Our second guest, Professor Matthias Lehmann, is a historian of modern Europe and Mediterranean Jewish history at UCI. He is an elected member of the American Academy of Jewish Research, co-editor of the journal Jewish Social Studies, and the author of several books, including Emissaries from the Holy Land and Ladino Rabbinic Literature and Ottoman Sephardic Culture. And we are here to speak about his new book, slightly less hot off the press, but not by no means lukewarm. And that book is entitled The Baron, Maurice de Hirsch and the Jewish 19th Century. And this, like Jessica's book, is a fabulous new work. This book is also a study of an individual, but not quite a biography, an exploration of Maurice de Hirsch, a banker, railroad entrepreneur, and one of the major Jewish philanthropists of the modern era. Dr. Marglin and Dr. Lehmann were, in addition to the books that they have written, were also co-authors on an edited book called Jews and the Mediterranean. And I think later in the conversation, I may invite them to reflect on whether that collaboration informed their work on these present books. But I want to start with a different kind of question. I want to start by asking about who is the subject of these books. It might seem, Matthias, that you have written a biography, but it really isn't. It might seem that you have written a history of a man's complex life and death, but it also really isn't. So I wonder if you would speak about the protagonists at the heart of your book, which perhaps is Nissim Shamama and perhaps Baron de Hirsch, but also possibly philanthropy and modern law, and certainly for both of you, the 19th century. So this will be one of the longer questions we'll let you ask, but maybe we'll start with you, Jessica, and then move to Matthias. Thank you and welcome.
Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, is this great? Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction, Sarah, for inviting us here, and Matthias, thanks for doing this together. It's so much more fun also for me to be in conversation, and it's really a privilege to be in conversation with the two of you. And more than that, both of you really helped shape this book, as both of you read it before it was, between covers, and so your mark is all over it, and I'm really grateful for that. It's such a good question, who is the protagonist of this book? And, I think even less than yours, Matthias, my book is not a traditional biography, especially since the first thing that happens is that the guy dies. But it also follows Nissim Shamama's life, right? It's sort of, the whole book is occasioned by his death because he dies and he leaves all of his money, and it's unclear who's going to get it, right? And this is one of these universal tropes. This happens all the time, still today. Somebody dies and there's a messy inheritance. But for historians, we get excited because then there's a lot of paper trail that we can follow. And so, I originally got interested in writing about Nissim Shamama from the paper trail left behind by his inheritance. And so you could say that it's inheritance and sort of the lawsuit over the estate that is really the subject of this book, that is really the heart. But I also think of it as kind of maybe a sort of superimposition of multiple protagonists. So Nissim Shamama himself is this totally fascinating figure who does, of course, take up a lot of airspace in the room, as it were. He has this not exactly rags to riches story, but a kind of, outsider to central player story, where he was just a member of the kind of middling elite of Jews in Tunisia and rose to power as a kind of government fixer in the early part of the 19th century. He's born in 1805. And so by the 1850s, he sort of maneuvers to take the place of this other Muslim government official who ends up absconding with a whole lot of the government's money, and Nissim becomes kind of the new guy, especially in the Ministry of Finance, and the new sort of right-hand man of the prime minister. And that position in itself, I think, is really interesting because, again, we think of Jews in 19th century North Africa as sort of marginalized, as dhimmis, as protected non-Muslims. And that is true. I mean, none of that is wrong. However, there were also all of these cases of these really powerful individuals, and most of the time we hear about them because of their money, because they become very rich. But Nissim actually first became powerful in the government, and through that power amassed a vast amount of wealth through tax farms, through investment, et cetera, et cetera. Then Nissim also leaves the country under somewhat shady circumstances, and he ends up sort of breaking with his former protector, the prime minister, and he first moves to Paris, and then he moves to Italy, and he dies not long after being in Italy, and it's only after his death that suddenly it really matters what his citizenship was. So I would say this is sort of the second protagonist of the book, is this question of citizenship. Belonging in a legal sense, what I call in the book legal belonging, which is trying to understand how are states thinking about state membership in new ways in the 19th century. How can we talk about that in a way that isn't this kind of older model of, modern citizenship invented in America in 1776 or in France in 1789, right? But rather thinking of state belonging, legal belonging, and state membership as really a messy process of evolution that doesn't play out exclusively in Europe or North America, but actually transcends borders. And this is kind of counterintuitive because we think of citizenship as perhaps the quintessentially state-bound thing that law can do, is decide who is in and who is out. But in fact, as the case of Shamama shows us, it's actually these sort of transnational, often marginal figures who are crossing state boundaries that force states to define who belongs and how do we know, right? And so Nissim Shamama, after he's dead, it becomes clear that everybody kind of assumed he was Italian, but actually it's not clear if he really became Italian, so maybe he was still Tunisian. And then there's the question of, maybe he's no longer Tunisian, but he didn't become Italian, so he's stateless. And fourth possibility, which I find fascinating, is the idea that he's neither Italian nor Tunisian, but rather that as a Jew, Jewishness is his nationality, and that he was one of these sort of transnational cosmopolitan figures who kind of just belonged to the Jewish nation, even though the Jewish nation didn't have a political home. And in fact, nobody at the time, he dies in 1873, nobody was really even thinking yet about Judaism as having a political state-based home in any serious way. This was really long before, decades before the Zionist movement kind of got off the ground. So I would say citizenship and trying to see citizenship as something that emerges across the Mediterranean is sort of the second protagonist. And then there are all these fascinating kind of minor characters who together form what I think of as a kind of Dickensian array of Mediterranean traversing Jews, Muslims, Christians, who to me was also one of the big reasons I got interested in this case, because I saw it as a way to kind of get at not exactly an ordinary life, because Nissim Shamama didn't have an ordinary life, but a sort of a world where personalities emerge from the archives, where you can really get a sense of the interplay between sort of state and legal narratives and just, people who are sometimes kind of assholes who fight with their relatives and who do things that you're like, oh, why did you do that? That was a terrible idea. And who make these claims and you're like, do you really think that? And so the kind of messiness of the human story that's largely surrounding Nissim was also something that I consider one of the protagonists of the book, and a way of kind of getting at this this connected world between North Africa and Europe.
Well, does this work? There's so much there that I could respond to, which is, I guess, the whole nature of this exercise. Because I think, even though the two books are on two very different topics, there's a lot of things that they have in common. But so let me start though with the thanks. So thank you, Sarah, for organizing. And I should also thank Jessica, who was also generous enough to read, the whole manuscript before it was done. And so your comments obviously were extremely valuable. Not that you're responsible for anything in the book, but it was certainly, yeah, exactly. And I suppose the event is called the Kahn Lectures in German Jewish Studies. And I think the reason I'm here is that at least my protagonist was born in Germany. And so there is this German Jewish angle. He was born, Baron de Hirsch was born in Munich. And, picking up on the question of belonging, legal or culturally or in any way you want to think about where does the protagonist of my book actually belong, really sort of opens up one of the central questions in the book. Baron Hirsch is from Germany, but can we call him a German Jew? Does that even mean anything? And it seems to me that it would have meant very little, if anything, to him. Baron Maurice de Hirsch was really one of the emblematic, in his own lifetime, one of the most famous figures of the period of the late 19th century. He was born in 1831. He passed away in 1896. And so his life, spans, a large portion of the 19th century. He was an emblematic figure. And so, every once in a while, Jewish historians have referenced Baron de Hirsch. Usually sort of, on the margins, or, they haven't really said much about him. But he does appear in many Jewish histories. But nobody really seems to know who he is. Sometimes he appears as a French Jew, an Austrian Jew, a German Jew, a Belgian Jew, an Alsatian Jew, a Parisian Jew. And it's not really clear who is he really. Now, some of those labels are just factually wrong. Some of them are factually accurate, but they don't really tell us anything either. And so one of the things that I really emphasize in the book is that we need to think about the story of this particular individual, the protagonist of the book, Baron Maurice de Hirsch, in a transnational perspective, in a way that often Jewish historians haven't really told the story of the Jewish experience of emancipation and so on and so forth in the 19th century, really focus on the transnational part of that story, because that individual, Baron Maurice de Hirsch, was leading really a transnational life. He was born in Munich, but he was sent at age 13 to Brussels, which is where he got married there. In the early 1870s, he moved to Paris, where he spent much of the rest of his life. But he made his fortune, and really one of the largest fortunes in Europe at the time, building railroads in the Ottoman Empire. The railroad that later comes to be known as the Orient Express, right, of Agatha Christie fame, right? But in the context of Jewish history, is most well known as a celebrity philanthropist with several major philanthropic initiatives, the largest of which being the Jewish Colonization Association, which he creates in 1891 with the goal of basically evacuating, the way he imagines it, originally evacuating millions of Russian Jews and resettling them in agricultural colonies in Argentina. And so the story of Baron Hirsch really happens in many different places, different countries in Europe, and indeed beyond Europe. And so when we think about the question of belonging, it's really not so clear where does he belong. In fact, he was born in Munich, so he was a Bavarian citizen. He becomes a citizen of Austria in 1877. But citizenship isn't really something that is all that important to him. In fact, his wife Clara, many years after they become Austrian citizens, she is not clear what her citizenship is, because she asks the Austrian embassy in Paris, oh, by the way, am I an Austrian citizen? And they say, yes, you are, because when your husband became an Austrian citizen, you became one automatically as well. But it's not a question, apparently, that she had even thought about for, 15 years or so, until for some, tax reasons or whatever, she bothers to ask. So in terms of belonging, citizenship that we tend to think of being so crucial in this particular story is really not crucial at all. So who is the protagonist of the book? I mean, Baron Maurice de Hirsch really is the protagonist. He doesn't die until the very end of the book. Well, I shouldn't say that because I want you to buy the book, so I don't want to give it away. So I really won't say too much else. Can I leave? I don't want to spoil the experience. So he really is the protagonist of the book. However, I do see the story of Baron Hirsch primarily as a way to open a window onto the Jewish 19th century, and as a way to think about the Jewish 19th century beyond the story of emancipation, which often happens in particular nation states, and which is the story that historians have very often been most interested in, but to think about the Jewish 19th century really as an age of empire, an age of global capital and labor markets, an age of mass migration, and an age really, and that's particularly important for the story of Baron Hirsch, an age of Jewish philanthropy, and that's really the central claim, I guess, in the book. Philanthropy in the late 19th century becomes sort of a defining element of this particular period in Jewish history, and philanthropy becomes, and we can unpack that and talk about what that means later, really becomes the primary focus or the primary expression really of Jewish politics, of Jewish political action. And because of that, because of that importance of philanthropy, the figure of Baron Hirsch turns out to be sort of the most useful, maybe, way for me to think about what makes this period in Jewish history distinct, and what are some of the broader themes that it brings out. Mm-hmm.
Lovely. Thank you so much for those reflections. You ended, Matthias, in the direction that I wanted to take us next, which is thinking about another protagonist of these two books, which is the 19th century. And it does strike me that these books, in a way, sit uneasily aside works of Jewish history that have theorized what the 19th century is all about. And Matthias, you just listed some of the characteristics that have traditionally been ascribed to this century by Jewish historians: a process of gradual emancipation, embourgeoisement, urbanization, mass migration, which I think Jewish historians tend to assume means departure but not return, slowly a move towards politicization, urbanization, and more, but those being the central touchstones. And yet here we have stories that really defy the norm, not only because the individuals involved are exceptionally wealthy, although that is one reason that they are not typical, but additionally because we are talking about people who were immensely mobile and in multiple directions, and whose lives do not follow, in terms of their where they do belong, a clear trajectory that seems to accord with what we have come to receive as the norm. Again, because they are moving in multiple directions, but also because their identities are complex and in some cases vague. So could we consider the 19th century another protagonist here? And if so, how do we describe its qualities? And might we think about the broader story of Jews and the 19th century differently in the wake of these explorations?
Do you want to start?
You start.
I start? Okay. So, yes, I mean, the 19th century is very much a, sort of the second protagonist. I believe it's the subtitle of the book, if I remember correctly. Yes, you said it's not hot off the press. It came out in August, so who knows? So yes, absolutely, the Jewish 19th century is the protagonist. And, obviously, Sarah Stein is sort of the pioneer in moving Jewish history in that transnational direction, right? That I think both Jessica and my book, kind of engage in that kind of enterprise as well, where the nation state is obviously always there. It's an important, but it's not the main story. And it's not the main story for two different reasons. First of all, most Jews in the 19th century don't live in nation states. They live in multinational empires. So we really need to, when we think about Jewish history, think beyond the nation state, because it's not necessarily a very useful frame for Jewish history, because most Jews don't come to live in a nation state until after World War I, but apart from the transnational angle that I think is really important, and to some extent, a distinctive feature of this particular, transitional period, if you will, towards an order that is going to revolve around nation states, but it doesn't yet. So another important element, I think, is the question of how did Jews interact with the society around them. And so corollary to the general narrative of emancipation as a process or a project that defines the Jewish 19th century, Jewish historians often talk about a process of assimilation, or maybe integration, or maybe acculturation. And the example of Baron Hirsch, I think, for me, and it even surprised me when I was going through the papers and the material that I use in the book, really challenges this notion of a process of assimilation. And that is really one of the main features of the 19th century. And it leads sort of to a slow erosion of Jewish, if not of Jewish identity, then of Jewish solidarity. Because Baron Hirsch himself actually very much embraced assimilation as a goal. And he was quite controversial when he gave an interview in an American newspaper in 1889, when he said, basically the answer to the Jewish question is for the Jews to disappear. Right? That was the bottom line. How do we solve the problem of anti-Semitism? Once the Jews disappear. What does he mean? Once Jews fully assimilate, or amalgamate is the term that he uses, assimilate into Christian society. And it doesn't matter whether that's in America or somewhere else, in Europe, even in Eastern Europe, if that is the preferred trajectory, right? Assimilation is a goal. That is the ideal. And he understands assimilation in not just in cultural terms, but in terms of intermarriage and in terms of religious assimilation too, right? So he's pretty radical in his commitment to assimilation. And yet he spends his entire fortune, or almost his entire fortune, on Jewish causes, right? And his most important project is to relocate millions of Russian Jews to Argentina to create Jewish agricultural colonies, right? And so I think what we see in the example of Baron Hirsch is that assimilation is really not sort of a teleological process that leads from tradition to, I don't know, somehow a disappearance of Jewish distinctiveness, but it's really it can be a radical reimagining of where Jews belong in the modern age. And it's not what Orthodox and religious Jews would have liked to see, and it's not what the Jewish reform movement would have liked to see, and it's not what the Zionist movement was proposing necessarily, but it's a vision of the Jewish future that sees Jews merging into mainstream society, and Judaism as a distinct entity may be disappearing, but in the meantime, right, Baron Hirsch was committed to make sure that Jews survive. He was interested in the survival of Jews, not so much interested in the survival of Judaism. And so I think it really forces us to rethink assimilation as sort of this master narrative that we often think of when it comes to the 19th century. There is more to be said about the connection of Baron Hirsch's philanthropic project and colonization project and the question of emerging Jewish nationalism and Zionism, which is also part of the 19th century, but we can come back to that
I'd love to come back to
in
that.
a later round.
Yeah, that's great, and I think complicating assimilation is a really worthy goal, and I find that especially when I'm teaching undergraduates, that assimilation is sort of the only model that they have in their head, and that's, I think, something that we need to work on as academics, is to give people other models. I think similarly, my vision of the Jewish 19th century came out of a kind of frustration with the limits of the sort of current scholarship, and that's in many ways why I ended up writing this book, but from a different perspective. Mainly an historian of Jews in North Africa in the 19th century, I've always felt like we get ghettoized, not to use an overloaded term, but that there's a kind of really radical separation between the way historians think about what's going on in North Africa and to some extent the rest of the Middle East, although really North Africa is the most ghettoized, and Europe, right? So the Jewish history is different. And if there's a connection, it's the connection of organizations like the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which are sending over their enlightened Jews to North Africa and the Middle East to bring modernity, right? And so I was frustrated by this model, in part because it's so much, and this is something that you both have written about, how do we do a history of Jewish modernity in North Africa and the Middle East that isn't just one of sort of copying what Jews are doing in places like France and Germany, etc. And I wanted to think about some of these big themes: belonging, emancipation, how do Jews fit into modernizing political orders, from a North African perspective. And that was one of the things that I was so excited about in starting to work on this book, is that there are voices from North African Jews and Muslims who are saying, this whole emancipation model, you think you have it all figured out, but actually that makes no sense for for how to understand the place of Jews in a place like Tunisia. First of all, Tunisian Jews, yes, they're not exactly equal to Muslims, but they are equally entitled to justice, right? Jews and Muslims are both entitled to justice before the Qadi, the judge, before the Bey, who is the sort of ruler of Tunisia at the time. And that this is an important thing to understand. Thus, Jews, this comes up in the question of, are Jews in Tunisia even citizens? Because citizenship implies a certain equality. So can somebody like Nissim Shamama even ever be considered a Tunisian if he is Jewish and thus assumed to be not equal? And the response by a man named Hossein ibn Abdallah, who's a Mamluk, actually a slave of the Bey originally, and then eventually emancipated, becomes a very high government official. He says, Jews in Tunisia in fact, are more equal than Jews in Europe. And it's not just because they have access to justice before the law, but because Tunisia continues to respect Jewish law as the dominant framework for Jews, whereas in a place like Italy or France, they are forced to be under civil law. And this is actually a disservice to Jews. This is a less freedom for them because they don't have the option of going to a Jewish court. They don't have the option of living their lives according to halakha. And he's echoed in this by this unsavory character who nonetheless is really fascinating, originally Algerian Jew who makes his life in Tunisia, Abraham al-Maniach, Eliyahu al-Maniach, or Leon el-Milek is his sort of Italianized name. And el-Milek says, goes even farther. He sort of says, there are Jews in what he calls constitutional countries, by which he means where Jews are emancipated. But these Jews actually are kind of forced to follow French law or Italian law, and it is Jews in places like Tunisia that have the most freedom because we can choose between the Jewish court or the Qadi court, the Sharia court, where we can go according to Islamic law, or we can appeal to the Bey. We have all of these options, and this is in fact sort of, more free. And ultimately what this made me think of is that, yes, these narratives about emancipation are very important. And yes, they're being considered by Jews and Muslims in North Africa, but that they're not just being sort of swallowed whole. There isn't this sense of, Napoleon emancipated the Jews and then slowly everybody else in the world eventually gets to the same place, right? There's very serious pushback in saying, actually, we have a different model of what we think equality should look like, which we actually think works better for Jews. And this was something that Muslims and Jews were saying. And it's interesting in part because it never gets adopted, so it sort of gets forgotten from history in some ways. But I don't think that means it's unimportant either historically or either at the time or now for historians, precisely because this was a moment of possibility. This was a moment where the idea of radical emancipation, as one might call it, along the models of the French, where there is sort of no legal difference is preserved, that wasn't yet assumed to be the model that everybody would eventually adopt. And so in this imperial 19th century, where multinational empires were the norm, actually the idea that different communities, including different religious communities, might have different laws was totally plausible, and in fact might have seemed like a much better idea to many people. And so to me, the interest of this case for rethinking the Jewish 19th century is to sort of in some ways turn these narratives of assimilation and emancipation on their heads and to look at them, as it were, from North Africa towards Europe as opposed to from Europe towards North Africa, and to see that there was really a different vision of Jews' place in the 19th century in modernizing states.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So another question, which I think gets at something fundamental in both books, has to do with how we understand Jewishness in the relationship to these figures, to their effects. And by effects, I suppose it's a double entendre, because on the one hand, it's their legal effects, their testamentary effects, and on the other hand, it is their philanthropic effects. And I was really struck by two moments in the two books where you were asking questions about this. Jessica, in your book, there was one remarkable moment where there is the case Shamama v. Shamama in Livorno. What's the year?
It starts in 1873, yeah, but
Okay,
it doesn't end until
1873.
1883.
And I probably will not do justice to this, but there is the legal question of whether Shamama's estate should be adjudicated according to Italian law, Tunisian law, potentially French law, lesser so.
Yeah, French law does come in, actually, yes, yeah.
And then also the question of whether it can be understood to exist in an orbit of Jewish law. And indeed, the results judge that he was legally prone to Jewish law. And you write something to the effect of he hovers somewhere above state law in the Mediterranean in an orbit of Jewish law, which really didn't exist. It was true and it was a fiction at the same time. But Matthias, you're also grappling with questions about Jewishness. And you ask at one point, what is Jewish about this family, who in some sense was so idiosyncratic? And given the quotation that you just reminded us of Baron de Hirsch, addressing the idea that the answer to the Jewish question is that Jews would disappear. To me, it raises this complex set of questions about what Jewishness is analytically and historically, and to the people involved, and whether the answers given, such as this idea that there is a Jewish national identity, which again is a fiction at this time, whether we need to move into terrain where this idea of the Jewish is murkier than we have assumed. I don't know who to ask first. Matthias, maybe you.
Yeah. And if we had asked Baron Hirsch that question, we would have gotten a rather, not a very clear answer. Because when you look at his correspondence or even his published writings, when he refers to other Jews, he likes to talk about co-religionists, which is a term that they just use all the time to refer to other Jews. Now, for somebody so militantly secular and committed to assimilation, it's funny, right, to define Jewishness as if it was all about religion when you don't really care about religion anymore, and it's not really how you see the Jewish future. He also often refers to people who belong to my race, and he talks about Jews as a race. Now, not the way that we use the term race in the United States today, I would venture, but he does talk about race when he talks about Jewishness. And now you might say that these are contradictory. They're certainly not thought out, and they certainly weren't thought out by Baron Hirsch himself. But I think there is this sort of a slippery, understanding that we're Jewish, and everybody, we kind of know that we are. Not necessarily a deep reflection on what it means. But in part, that's what I find interesting about Baron Hirsch as a philanthropist. Historians have been so fascinated by all these philosophers and rabbis and writers and intellectuals who have deep, deep thoughts about Jewishness in the 19th century or whatever period. But most Jews just went about their lives, right? And Jewishness was, interestingly enough, still in the 19th century, in this age of presumably emancipation, maybe assimilation, something that at the same time was also taken for granted by everyone. It was just something you were. And it's interesting, right? I mean, Baron Hirsch's son, Lucien de Hirsch, has a romantic relation with an English aristocrat, Lady Jessica Sykes. And in one of her letters, she refers to him sort of offhand, as, you're co-religionist, okay, alluding to his Jewish identity, even though there isn't really anything Jewish in the letters that he writes. And she also refers to, and your compatriots, when she is talking about some people who speak German. And it was interesting to me because Lucien de Hirsch was not a German citizen. He was born in Belgium. His father had been from Munich, but he studied in university in Germany for a couple of years. But that was basically it, right? He was not German in any sense of, he was not a citizen. He wasn't really identifying with Germany in any kind of way. But that's how he was perceived. Just like Jewishness was something that was natural and he was perceived as such, even though it wasn't really something that comes through in his letters. And so when we think about Jewishness, but really attributes of identity in other kinds of ways, not just Jewishness, I think, this particular example, the Hirsch family, is a reminder that people are not always as consistent as we would like them to be as historians, right? That can check multiple boxes, and they can change their mind from morning to evening about how they, you were speaking of affective ties, right? How they see themselves, not in some legal sense of belonging, but how they feel about what they are. Now, for Baron Hirsch, of course, philanthropy is the main expression, the main practical expression of how he sees his own place in the world. And when you look at his philanthropic oeuvre, Sure, he does spend money on all kinds of philanthropic causes and makes sure to emphasize that it's really, it benefits everyone. It's not just Jews, but most of it does benefit Jewish causes very specifically. So clearly he sees his place in the world as somebody who wants to reshape or change the Jewish future. And so that is so he feels very strongly about being Jewish, belonging to some larger entity that, in terms of religion, race, we don't know. Nation is what we call Jewish. And he wants to shape the Jewish future, the collective future of the Jews in interesting ways, and sometimes in provocative kinds of ways when he advocates radical assimilation, or when he wants to relocate millions of them from one place to another and turn them into farmers in South America. But that is what he is passionate about. That is what he wants to do. So we often think of, well, if you're really committed to your Jewishness, you imagine a future that is all about people always being very, very Jewish in a national and a religious and some other kind of way. That is not the Baron Hirsch story, right? He's not interested in the future of Jewishness, but he's interested in the future of the Jews as people, as Jewish bodies, if you will, right? And so for him, that is very, very central. But what it means when he's thinking about the Jewish future is not necessarily captured by any of the categories of Jewishness that we usually employ.
Yeah, this is such a great question, and in some ways, in this sense, I think Shamama couldn't have been more different, because he lived a very pious life. He was sort of, an observant Jew throughout, as far as we know, and he was shockingly unconcerned about the future, given the sloppiness of his own sort of, taking care of his own estate and making sure that everything was in order for when he eventually would have passed away. So unlike Baron Hirsch, who put all of this time and energy into not only his legacy, but the future of the Jews, Shamama seemed to be, I think maybe he was just a bit in denial of death, which is also fairly universal, his relation, but similarly, his relationship with Judaism, or with Jewishness rather, was just a kind of natural reality. He was Jewish. That was and I've often thought to myself, what is the same question if I had Nissim Shamama in a room and I could say, where do you think you belong? Who are you? Certainly, I think the one thing that I can say with any assuredness is that he would have said, well, I'm Jewish. That was the one thing that followed him. And you see that, his certainly in Tunis, he's the leader of the Jewish community, the Qa'id al-Yahud, which has a whole kind of not only political but also legal role. He gives an enormous amount of philanthropy to other Jews in Tunisia. When he moves to Paris, he gives philanthropy to Jews in Paris. When he moves to Livorno, he gives philanthropy in Livorno. In his will, he does the thing that Matthias has also written about, that many Jews all over the world are doing still in this period, which is he designates a lot of his fortune to go to the poor Jews in the land of Israel, in the 4 holy cities, Jerusalem. And in fact, in Jerusalem, they build a yeshiva under his name, which is still there. So he's definitely identified as Jewish. But the whole discussion of Judaism as a nationality, as some kind of legal status that transcends borders, I don't think Nissim Shamama would have made any sense of that. I think if you had told him before he died, after your death, lots of high-powered Italian lawyers are going to try to make sense of Judaism as a nationality, and they're going to use you as an example. He would have said, like, a what? Judaism as a nationality? What are you talking about? And I think that is about this moment. I mean, you say nationality, Jewish nationality is a fiction. I would go so far as to say all nationality is a fiction. It's just been so naturalized over the course of the almost 200 years that nationality has been a big force in the modern world that we tend to not think of it as a fiction, but it shows up more clearly as a fiction in the 19th century, and that's part of why I'm so interested in this idea of a Jewish nationality as having legal legs, because in the 19th century, the whole idea of what constitutes a nationality, do you need a state to have a nationality, that was still kind of unclear, right? And what I love also about this case is that it brings in these pretty, high-powered personalities. So the two main lawyers on the case are, one guy is this giant of international law at the time, Pasquale Stanislao Mancini, who is sort of like really one of the founding fathers of modern international law, period, and also came up with the whole idea of what's called the nationality principle, the idea that nationality should be sort of enshrined in international law, and particularly in international private law, such that if your nationality is Italian, that is so important to who you are that Italian law should follow you wherever you go. And if you die in France, Italian law should still apply to your estate. If you get married in the Ottoman Empire, Italian law should still have jurisdiction over your marriage. And this should be a kind of, global situation where nationality is so sacred. He was central in the Risorgimento, the thing that made Italy into the movement that made Italy into a nation starting in the 1840s. And this was his sort of contribution to Italian nationalism, was to speak it in a language of international law. So first, long before he knows anything about Nissim Shamama, he literally writes the part of the Italian civil code that says what should happen if a foreigner dies in Italy, and he enshrines this basis of nationality principle. And then, of course, when Shamama dies, who better than to prove Nissim Shamama's nationality than the father of the nationality principle? So they hire Mancini. But Mancini actually is really faced with a conundrum when it comes to arguing this question of, is Judaism a nationality? Because he's uber-nationalist. He is a father of nationalism in general, Italian nationalism in specific. And in many ways, all the things that he's written about nationality applies perfectly to Jews. Everything that he said about the importance of nationality and nationalism, the idea of a single race, which again, everybody thought Jews were a race at the time, a single culture, a language that unites them. Jews have Hebrew, Italians have Italian, a history, a shared sort of sense of region, right? All of this applies to Jews, but he also doesn't want to say that Jews have a separate nationality, in part because he's also a good liberal and he wants Italian Jews to be Italian, not Jews. And if he argues for Jewishness as a nationality, that goes again his kind of nice, liberalist principles by which, Italian Jews are fully Italian. And it's, this is one of the ways in which I think Jews are obviously so interesting, and the 19th century is the most interesting time to study Jews. It's because all of these big questions about what is a nation, what is nationalism, what should a state look like, Jews always end up complicating the answers, right? They're the square peg that never fits into the round hole. And this is true in Italy, it's true in Tunisia, it's true in the Ottoman Empire, it's true in France. And that's part of why I think Jews actually make for such a great way of doing this kind of transnational history, is precisely because they bring up these uncomfortable questions kind of wherever they go.
Great. I think that I'm going to ask perhaps two more questions, and then we'll turn to a group conversation. So here is the first of those two, and I'm squishing things together, so do the best that you can. I was interested that anti-Semitism emerges in both books as a theme, perhaps not a central or abiding theme, but a present theme. Matthias, in your account, we see how anti-Semitic tropes circulate around Baron de Hirsch and the Hirsch fortune and European Jews more generally around the moment of the financing of the Ottoman Rail. Jessica, in your account, it's really mostly in the epilogue where you are reflecting on the ways in which the Shamama case left legacies and could be interpreted and misinterpreted and reinterpreted, sometimes through an anti-Semitic lens. So I would be very curious for you to both speak about that and perhaps to contextualize it a bit in the context of perhaps this is fair, perhaps this is unfair, but shifting political tides around empires and what the rising tide of imperialism means for Jews. Imperialism and semi-imperialism, I think, in the Ottoman case. But also maybe in the Argentinian case. Well, anyway, I'll let you answer what that means. But but the echo through the two books was very striking to me and actually unexpected.
Yeah, and I admit that, when I started, working on Baron Hirsch, I didn't necessarily expect it to be a story about anti-Semitism. And yet, once you read the sources, you realize it is everywhere, even when you don't expect it. For instance, when, the story of the Ottoman railroads, which, is just a big infrastructure project, which by definition was messy. But what does anti-Semitism have to do with anything, right? And I realized quickly when reading, especially in Austrian and German newspapers, about the Ottoman Railroad project, and of course, all kinds of things went wrong. There was a global financial crisis in 1873, and the Ottoman Empire declared bankruptcy, and there was a war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire in 1877-78, and so all kinds of things went wrong and really complicated the completion of these railroads. So there are all kinds of factors out there that made the completion of the railroads difficult. But what appears in the Austrian and the German press time and again is the following narrative. Baron Hirsch got this concession to build the railroad to connect the Ottoman Empire to Austria, to the Austrian railroads. This is our opportunity, as Austrians, our opportunity to join the great, colonial, imperial expansion of the time. Why should the British and the French and the Belgians or whatever be the only ones who have an empire? We Austrians also have a right to our own imperial and colonial ambitions. Where? In the Ottoman Balkans. How? By leveraging this railroad that Baron Hirsch is going to build. That is going to turn the Ottoman Balkans basically into an Austrian colony or semi-colony, right? So that was sort of the narrative that emerged in these newspapers, especially early on. Now things, don't work out quite like that. The completion of the railroad is delayed time and time again. So who is responsible? And responsible is the Parisian financier Baron Hirsch. And interestingly enough, in many of these reports, you don't even have to mention the religion of that particular financier because everybody understands what the story is about. It becomes a story about Baron Hirsch representing Jewish capital that explains everything. And whether it's the messiness of, international capital markets when the Vienna, stock exchange crashes in 1873, or whether it's the complication of just the nature of this kind of, huge infrastructure project, or whether it's the fallout of the Russo-Ottoman War. The story, the narrative that is created is one about Baron Hirsch as responsible. Single-handedly, somehow, he's responsible for everything that goes wrong. And not always explicit, but always just below the surface that everybody would understand what they're really talking about is, this is sort of a Jewish conspiracy going on. Now, interestingly enough, Baron Hirsch is not too concerned about that. He thinks that anti-Semitism in the West, in Central Europe and Western Europe, is an issue, but it's just going to go away because it's anachronistic. He is convinced that anti-Semitism is just stupid, and therefore it's going to go away because, how could anybody believe it? However, anti-Semitism is deeply ingrained in the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire, by 1890, he basically gives an interview in the London Times, and he says, look, I've come to understand that the Russian government wants to get rid of all of its Jews. There are only two ways to do this. Either they kill them all, or we have to evacuate them. Right? And it seems like a strange thing, but 1890, that's what he's saying, and it resonates. And everybody says, yeah, well, apparently that's what's happening. And so he says, so we're going to evacuate them. And here I come in as the philanthropist. I'm going to take care of this problem. There is this problem of Russian anti-Semitism. It's not going to be resolved by emancipation or anything like that. It's just not going to happen. So we have to move them to another place, to a safe haven. Where are we going to move them? And in the 1890s, the question of where can the Jews of Eastern Europe, especially the millions, the 5 million Jews from the Russian Empire, where can they go, becomes the most urgent question that Jewish philanthropists and politicians and public figures are confronting. And that's the question that Theodor Herzl is thinking about in 1896 when he publishes his Jewish state. And that is the question that Baron Hirsch is thinking about in the 1890s as well. The Russian Jews are the issue. Where will they go? Right? Now, the United States is already sort of an anti-immigrant backlash in the 1890s. So there's increasingly a question, maybe that's not necessarily the best way. Europe is kind of out of the question because most European countries don't want any more Jewish immigrants. England, which is receiving most of them, is definitely not interested in having more Jewish immigrants. So where are they going to go? And that's where the context of imperialism or the imperial expansion becomes really important. Because Jewish figures, Hirsch, Herzl, and many others, find in European imperialism, let's say, a potential answer. For the first time in history, it becomes a plausible prospect to say, well, there are all these other places out there in the world, which is not the United States and not Europe. How about one of those places as a place where we could send the Russian Jews? Right? Now, for Baron Hirsch, this is not a proto-Zionist project of creating a Jewish state somewhere, but it's a project of finding a homeland for Jews where finally nobody will bother them. But it only makes sense in the late 19th century where European states are thinking about how do we solve the social question. Well, maybe if we get enough of our poor people, our working class, not much the working class, but the poor people to emigrate and to move somewhere else, maybe to the colonies, maybe to Latin America, maybe that's how we deal with the social question. So Baron Hirsch basically is saying the same thing. There's a Jewish question. How do we solve it? By having these Jews move somewhere else. And so he just goes through different proposals, various, European colonies and so on. In the end, he decides Argentina is the place to go. Because it's a large country, it's a country that is looking for European immigrants. So that's where he's going to establish, this utopia, basically the Jewish colonization on a large scale, which of course in the end, doesn't quite happen on that large scale, but that is the project that he embraces. And it can only happen, it only makes sense in that particular moment in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question of anti-Semitism is, I think, really also surprising. It was surprising to me in the Shamama case and in writing it, and it doesn't show up in the places you would think. And I think, so, I sort of mentioned a little bit about Shamama's biography. He starts out as this sort of, very central government official, makes a lot of money, and then he leaves in 1864, really in the middle of an uprising, of basically a civil war, and it's very chaotic. And at first, it seems, he does eventually break with his patron, but at first it seems that he's basically leaving on good terms, right? There's no outward break. He gets a letter from the Bey, the ruler of Tunisia, who says you can go, and then when people write about him in the next, before his death, right, in the next about 5-ish years, they write about him as basically a government official who's gone away. He's still involved in Tunisian government politics. He's trying to get a loan. He's like in touch with all of the different Tunisian government agents who are in Paris, which is where he lives until 1871. And it's only with the essentially bankruptcy of the Tunisian state, which is declared in 1869, where Tunisia just defaults on all of its loans, which to this point are mostly owed to this French financier, banker of German Jewish origin, a man named d'Erlanger, but who is his father converted to Christianity. Of course, he is still perceived as Jewish, because all financiers with any connection to Judaism are perceived as Jewish. And the Tunisian government, when it defaults on its loans, basically it gets this sort of essentially caretaker government that is led by a French guy, because d'Erlanger is French and because the French are already eyeing Tunisia as a future colony. So they send a guy who clearly doesn't like Nissim Shamama or his former patron. And he writes the sort of first kind of incriminating report that says that Nissim Shamama didn't actually leave, on kosher terms, that he actually absconded, that he took money that was owed to the government. But he says this in a way that's basically kind of like outing all of these different Tunisian officials as skimming from the treasury, right? Nissim Shamama is by far not the only one. But nonetheless, he's the first one who says, yeah, I'm suspicious of Nissim Shamama, and it's this French guy. Then later, at the moment of colonization, an extremely anti-Semitic screed gets published, which has this interpretation of the decade leading up to colonization, leading to French colonization of Tunisia in 1881, saying that essentially it was all orchestrated by Nissim Shamama, d'Erlanger, the Jewish banker, who was, again, in this context, seen as Jewish, and the former prime minister, Nissim Shamama's patron. But he is sort of basically, this poor Muslim prime minister is basically the dupe of these evil Jews, right? And this is this kind of, flagrantly anti-Semitic screed, which it's not entirely clear how much sort of purchase it gets, except that then when the first, real history of this period is written by a French guy named Jean Gagnage, about whom we don't know enough in terms of his own personal proclivities, but he writes this in the 60s. He writes sort of really still the definitive history of this period of Tunisia, and it is just shot through with anti-Semitism. So Nissim Shamama comes out very badly. He was the one who basically single-handedly ruins the finances of Tunisia, but also all of the other Jews who are active in Tunisian politics and Tunisian finance at this time are all in cahoots with him, and they're all ruining the country. And this is in the 1960s. This is like a French guy, right? And his... Among scholars and specialists of Tunisian history, it's sort of well known that this guy Gagnage is clearly, whether he himself was anti-Semitic or just wrote a deeply anti-Semitic book, I won't say, but the book is deeply anti-Semitic. But nobody has sort of rewritten this history. And even though that's not what I'm doing here, although somebody should do it, if anybody's out there looking for a dissertation topic on Tunisian history, the 1860s and 1870s are in sore need of a reinterpretation. But it becomes very clear that that kind of anti-Semitism becomes the accepted trope from this first French finance guy sent in 1869 to take over Tunisian finances through a century later, when you have the first kind of French historian. There is a either subtle or very explicit undertone of anti-Semitism throughout the way that they have viewed not only Nissim Shamama himself, but just the Tunisian state in general in this period. And I think this connects to your question about imperial politics, because it is still a very problematic way in which we read Jewish history of the Middle East and North Africa in particular as some kind of almost hermetically sealed space where the relations between Jews and Muslims exist in some kind of historic isolation that comes basically from the Quran. But actually, the relationships between Jews and Muslims and the way the Jews have been thought about in the past are enormously influenced also by the imperial context, and specifically the French imperial context, in which this history has been written essentially up until now. And it's really only now that scholars are starting to rethink the ways in which French views of Jews, and more specifically French anti-Semitism, has colored the way that Jews are remembered. And whenever I talk to anybody who knew anything about Tunisian history in the 19th century and said I was writing a book on Nissim Shamama, they were like, oh, the guy who stole all the money from the state. And I was like, and frankly, he probably did steal some money from the state, but probably everybody who was working for the state at that time was skimming a little bit. I don't think he was unique in that sense. And when I first started, I was just like, oh, well, I guess I've got a colorful character, and it's interesting to write about people who have problematic pasts. But it wasn't until much, much later that I realized the extent to which his story is imbricated in this broader sort of French anti-Semitic context that I would never have known, right? Because it has been so internalized, including in the memory of Tunisian Jews, right? I've talked to a number of people who are vaguely related to the Shamama family, and they always say it with shame. It's a shameful fact, because Nissim Shamama is a kind of shameful figure. And I think in some ways that's the reason nobody's written about him, because he doesn't really, for Tunisian Jews who want to write about their own history, he's a bit unsavory, and for Tunisian Muslims, he's very unsavory. And it's sort of you need somebody who can kind of reimagine these somewhat naive narratives about Tunisian Jewish history to realize that he's actually super interesting.
It's actually just a minute. I mean, it's actually interesting. The story of the Ottoman railroads is the same thing, right? It's a story about corruption very often,
totally,
right? Exactly. And so Hirsch is, bribing everyone, and maybe he did. I mean, these big infrastructure projects, even today, right? We kind of realize it, Anyway, we can all think of examples, right? But so it's a story about corruption. But parallel to what you were describing is that the little research or the little that has been written about the story of the Ottoman railroads is based by and large on works that were published in the early 20th or late 19th centuries, which were basically anti-Semitic, pieces of anti-Semitic propaganda identifying Baron Hirsch as the arch villain, and but they've become sort of the raw material for people who have told the story of the Ottoman railroads in subsequent decades.
Right. Yeah, and I think, just very quickly, Baron Hirsch, in his view of sort of how to solve the Jewish problem, also, that hasn't become the kind of dominant way that people think about Jewishness today, and so his story also, for that reason, has been obscured, and I think that's part of what we're both doing, is trying to reimagine the Jewish 19th century as it looked at the time, as opposed to how it looks looking back from hindsight of the 20th century.
And I would say in response that Matthias and I were discussing beforehand how it might also be that the contemporary moment with a resurgence of anti-Semitism nationally and globally makes these stories inescapable and all too relevant in a way that historians writing even a decade ago might not have chosen to amplify these elements of the two histories that you explore.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to open the table up to conversation and questions, and I think what I will do is take them in pairs of two, allowing you to choose what you wish to address. So please, if you'd like to begin.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the panelists for their excellent presentations today, and talking about the universal Jew, the assimilation process. I've just come back from a trip to Israel, Rome, and Lisbon, and it spiked my curiosity because basically I always thought of myself as an Ashkenazi Jew with Ukrainian family out of Kiev and Odessa. But a couple, 2-3 years ago, finding out from some genetic testing, I don't know how reliable, that it showed some 4 or 5% of North African ancestry. So I'm in Rome, and I'm with friends, and I go to the synagogue in Rome, and basically I take a tour of Jewish Rome. And right after the synagogue tour, where I'd been before, we go a block away to the kosher restaurants, right next to, in the Jewish quarter, near the synagogue. And just seeing the fact that they label the restaurants kosher. These are Italians. And in my tour, the tour guide suggests or says that the Italian Jews, the majority or 90% came from Libya. I'm not sure if that could be corroborated, but in the tour, he's saying most of the Jews in Italy came out of Libya. And then we're sitting, and then also, I pick up from the tour guide that that the Jewish kosher cooking, the slow cooking process, was brought from Jews from Amsterdam, who brought it over to Italy and Europe in general. Their cooking kosher process, getting ready for Shabbat. and coming up with this slow cooking process. So, can I continue?
Do you want to maybe focus in on the question?
The question is generally the North African connection in Italy, and then the Moorish influence in Lisbon. If you've been in Lisbon, the Moorish influence, because you're walking in the streets of Lisbon and you're seeing Moorish Muslim tiles on the sidewalks and all over. So the basic question is, in terms of your model for assimilation of Jews and the wandering Jews, I would go back to the other model of the Inquisition Jews and how they have, came and then, spread and became assimilation. So in terms of assimilation.
Thank you for your thoughts. Maybe if you don't mind, I'll take another voice. You put out so many questions, and we'll add one more and let the panelists choose how to respond. Others, I'm moving across. Yes, please.
I'm just wondering about the forms of, or the methods of communication between communities, and the way they were able to maintain a consistent form of religious practice. So it's understandable to me how you can have similarities in practice from Czech areas in the Czech Republic, Germany, Poland. How do you maintain that from North Africa to Poland to Persia? Like, how is that communicated?
Rebecca, did you have a hand, or did I misread you? We'll add you in. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering, I'm just curious as to where the genesis of these projects are, and then kind of what got you started on these particular characters, and I kind of how you ended up kind of from the one person to then a book that one person plays such a significant role in, but the book isn't necessarily about that one person. And I know that Sarah asked a question in the beginning kind of about that fact, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit to more of the process by which you kind of got from A to B, because I'm assuming it was an interest in these people that sparked it and then figuring out what to do with that, but maybe I assumed wrong.
Thank you. Omar, or do you want to deal with this first? We'll add one more. Omar, please. No, Omar, go ahead.
Thanks, Matthias and Jessica. These are really incredible projects. So I have a question which connects to Sarah's work that I think Matthias nodded to at some point in your answers, which has to do with the question of circulation. I think these projects are really also a project of circulation, not only bodies, of Jewish, quote-unquote Jewish bodies, but also of ideas. So when I think about the three of you, and I'm going to add and put Sarah on the spot here, I think when I think about the three of you, this is really an interesting theoretical moment in Jewish studies, and probably in history, in Jewish history, is how we think about not only European history, the Mediterranean, North African, and Jewish history. And I think that's something that you, Jessica, mentioned as far. You don't want to get why. I agree with you. I think you spot on mentioned that. So how to do this project, in addition to reflecting on the question of circulation, can you also talk to us a little bit about the archives? How did you do this project by basically moving around and thinking about these archives that are actually moving around the spaces you're thinking about? And if you can reflect on that.
Well, can I ask a teeny birthday question?
Well, so maybe what we'll do is we'll add Milt's question, because I think it's the last hand, and then you'll both be able to pick and choose from whatever you're able to answer. Please.
Where did the Baron come from? Was that his quote nationality? A German duchy or something like that?
Oh, okay, I can start with it.
I told you it was a
Thank
baby
you for all the
question.
questions, and forgive us if we don't cover every element. So I turn it to you.
So, well, yeah, the Baron, I mean, that's an easy one. So Hirsch's father received the title of Baron in Bavaria for his services to the crown, to the Bavarian crown, and it's a hereditary title, so he carries that on. All the other questions, however, are more complicated. And I want to, yeah, and I want to come back to the point about assimilation, because you mentioned a number of different cultural points of reference, and I think one of the things that we often tend to forget when we talk about Jewish assimilation is that what did Jews, if they assimilated, then what did they actually assimilate to? And we often assume, well, into majority culture. But what does that even mean, right? We understand that majority culture, there are different cultures in different places, but is it even true that Jews assimilate into the majority culture? And in the case of Baron Hirsch, for instance, I think that it's sort of a particularly good example of assimilation within the of the family into a particular social class. Jews never just assimilate into a majority culture. There's no such thing. Most Jews, I think, in the 19th century try to assimilate to the extent that they want to assimilate into middle class bourgeois culture. That's their reference point. For some of the elites, like the Hirsch family, they try to assimilate into what we might call the new aristocracy. So the title, the Baron, is really important to them, right? They want to be part of that pan-European aristocratic class, and that's what they're assimilating to. So there's a reason they don't think much about nationality, because they deliberately want to assimilate or embrace the habitus, if you will, of a pan-European class, which is the aristocracy. The question of circulation, I think, is really crucial, right? And Jessica will have a lot more to say about that. So, but the one thing I was thinking about there is circulation. We often, right, Sarah mentioned that earlier, when we talk about Jewish migration, we often think about migration from A to B. Okay, Jews leave one country and they move to another country. And that's basically the migration story. And we know that migration stories are more complicated. People move back, people move to different places, different family members move to different places, and they maintain contact and so on. But circulation also means, in the case of Baron Hirsch's organization, the JCA, that, for instance, okay, so they're moving Russian Jews to Argentina, or really what is today Ukraine, that part of the Russian Empire, to Argentina. But who are the teachers in the schools that they're establishing in these colonies? And they decide, well, we need people who can have some Jewish knowledge and who speak Spanish. Where do they come from? Northern Morocco. Right, because that's where Sephardic Jews live who speak Spanish and have a Jewish education. And so
have been immigrating already to
and
South
have been
America.
immigrating anyway to South America, but sometimes they're just shipped in from Morocco directly,
yeah.
or even some Ottoman cities, right, to Argentina, because they bring the various skills that they're looking for. They're also more modern than these Russian Jews because they've been educated in the Alliance Israélite Universelle schools. So they tick all the boxes. They have the language, they have the Jewish background, they have the modernity that the Russian Jews are lacking. Right? So circulation complicates all these stories about the hierarchy of who's more civilized than who, right? Ashkenazi, Sephardic. Circulation mixes all of these stories together, right? And I think that's a crucial way for us to think in terms of Jewish modernity in different ways, not just by being transnational, but by really understanding circulation as a way that weaves all these different stories together. Circulation was really at the heart of my previous book on rabbinic emissaries, roaming, through the Jewish diaspora, raising money for the impoverished Jews of the Holy Land, of the land of Israel. And so that was sort of an early example of 18th century, let's say, Jewish philanthropy. And when you ask about the genealogy of this project, it really grows in some way out of that previous project, because I was interested in the emergence of sort of pan-Jewish networks, as I call them in the previous book, or pan-Judaism, so that pan-Jewish solidarity, which is constituted through movement and circulation and manifests itself in networks of philanthropy. And I was interested in following that story into the 19th century. And once you do that, then Baron Hirsch becomes sort of a figure that appears as a very prominent example of this philanthropic age. And so I decided to really make that sort of the central, his biography, sort of the central organizing focus of the book.
Yeah, so many great questions. I mean, I think maybe I'll start with the genesis of the project, because that's fun. And for me in particular, I think I really did just stumble into this case, and it was one of these things where I was researching something else, an article that I wrote about something really totally different, a Morocco-Algerian rabbi and his legal troubles. And I happened upon I was looking into a publisher, a guy named Elia Ben Amozeg, who is a very well-known sort of philosophical mystic from Livorno, from 19th century Italy, who was also a publisher to eat, right? That's what he did to make money. And he published some of these books, but then I was looking at what he himself had written, and he'd written a couple books about this case about Nissim Shamama, and I was like, that's interesting. I wonder what that's about. So I went down that rabbit hole, and I quickly found that there was just an enormous amount published, and that, my predecessors, a very wonderful historian of Jews in North Africa in general, and Jews in Tunisia in particular, known in French as Robert Attal and in Hebrew as Avraham Attal, so speaking of names, who was also like an eminent bibliographer, and he had collected all of these sources on the Shamama case. And so I started by just looking through all of these things that he had assembled, essentially. And at first I was like, there's got to be a book about this guy already, where, I just haven't found it yet. And again, he just somehow fell through the cracks of all the historiography. So there were just a few articles, two in French, and there was a dissertation chapter in Hebrew, and that was really it. And that was how I get started. And then when I got to the archives, so you said archives, so I'll now talk about, how do you then, because I do think one of the reasons that I got interested in this case was that it seemed to me that if I was going to write some kind of trans-regional history of Jews in North Africa that wasn't only about North Africa, that was really connecting Jews in North Africa to the broader world, one of the good ways to do it was to do one of these microhistories of either a person or a case or both that traversed these places. And so that was part of what got me interested in this case. And so the main archival kind of treasure trove was in Tunisia, in the Tunisian National Archives. And I have this very vivid memory of being there for the first time when I was just starting on this project. I wasn't even 100% sure I was going to write a whole book on this. I thought maybe it would just be an article. But then I got there, and there are literally like dozens of cartons of, big boxes of archival material about just Nissim Shamama. And I was like, this could be multiple books. I'm going to have a problem of having too much material. And then, I also realized that this would take me to archives in Italy, to archives in France, to archives in the Ottoman Empire. I did check in Israel. Actually, there wasn't that much in Israel, which is unusual for a case of Jewish history in the 19th century. And I think that, one of the things that you were also saying, Rebecca, why these sort of biographies that aren't really biographies, sort of pseudo-biographies, I think part of it is a way of trying to bring back to light a moment in Jewish history where lives were lived across boundaries, and that was sort of the norm. And that sometimes that's hard to do when you're looking from the sort of state level, and that it's easier to do from the individual level, from the level of a life, or in my case, really more a lawsuit. Finally, these questions of sort of community, sort of communication across communities, similar practices, which I actually think connects to your question about Libyan Jews in Italy. I think that there's an enormous amount of diversity in the Jewish world, and I think there often wasn't that much communication, and I think that we've, to a large extent, lost the radical localism of what Jewish life looked like. And so, like, the very idea of an Italian Jewry doesn't make any sense in 1850, even because there is no Italy, right? Italy only really comes to being sort of in the late 1850s, really I would say in the 1860s, and the Jews of Rome have a really different purchase on Judaism from the Jews of Livorno in particular. And Livorno is sort of the center to my story, in part because Livorno has been thought of as Italian Jewish history, but really it's a deeply Mediterranean town. It's a deeply Jewish and deeply Mediterranean town where you have these Jews who are Livornese, but they're Sephardic Jews who came and then immediately left, but kept a sort of foot in Livorno and would set up shop in Tunis or in Algiers or in Constantine or in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? Or eventually then in the 19th century you have Jews leaving Livorno also for Alexandria and other kind of boom towns. And I think that, again, that's part of what got me interested in this case, is just this idea of exploring a Jewish Mediterranean in addition to a Jewish 19th century.
Thank you. Well, these are two beautiful books, and you should read them, and you can buy them in the back of the room. So what we are going to do is thank our guests warmly for a wonderful presentation. And thank you all for coming to join us.
Yeah, great question.
And thank you for the wonderful questions.
Thank you. Thank you.